Ladies and gentlemen, faculty, students, community members, welcome to our Klatsky 2023 Distinguished Lecture. So we are really in for a treat this morning or this evening because in addition to our lecturer, we have Bruce Klatsky himself with us. So let me tell you just a little bit about our patron who makes this all possible. Bruce Klatsky was an alum of Western Reserve, and then he rose up to become the CEO of Phillips Van Heusen Corporation. And many of the shirts that I own are from that. It's one of the largest shirt manufacturers in the world. And he's told me the stories, and perhaps he'll share some with us today, about how he wanted to be the corporation that was on the leading edge of human rights, because so many corporations back then were being accused of child labor and other human rights violations. He also became a member of the board of Human Rights Watch, which is the foremost human rights organization in the United States. They're doing terrific stuff. And then he, in 2001, endowed our Klatsky Distinguished Lecture and 2 fellowships at Human Rights Watch. Over the years, since 2001, we have had 44 Human Rights Fellows. And one of them, Ellie, is in the back of the room today. And she did such a good job this summer that they've kept her working for pay during the semester. And we're looking forward to hearing all about that. Now, in addition, this distinguished lecture and the Human Rights Watch Fellowship really planted the seed for this law school's human rights program. And we got this endowment at just the point where we were starting our international law program. And so since then, we have created the Yemen Accountability Project, which has put us on the map. We have Jim Johnson here. This was his idea, but it was really the students at the law school and also the support of one of our alums, Tim Geis, that made that possible. So for the last 6 years, nobody else in the world has been documenting the atrocities in Yemen, preparing for eventual prosecution, but our students. And at one point, there were 70 of them working together. Now there's about 50. It's still the most popular student group, and the work they're doing is going to make an effect in the world. We also have an endowed asylum and refugee clinic. And so many of you, when you get to be third years, if you want to save people's lives who are facing persecution and torture, you can do that. You can argue cases in our immigration federal court down the road under the supervision of one of our best professors, Alex Hewitt. And so that's another part of our human rights program. Well, this year is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a particularly great year for us to have the Klatsky Lecture. And before I introduce the lecturer, I would like to ask Bruce Klatsky himself to come up and say some words. Bruce.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. I don't deserve anything that Michael said nice about me, but I'll accept it because one of my favorite grandchildren are in the room, and so she has to believe in me. I have to tell you that it's a real privilege to stand here today. And before I accepted Dean Scharf's invitation to speak on this anniversary date, I did it because he was able to attract one of the real heroes of the human rights movement, Leila Sadat. It's true, it's true. I'll abbreviate my 3 hours. He gave me 3, no, not really. Just speak for a few moments in Leila's honor. So Michael felt that some of you, I don't know why, would be interested in who I am. Michael felt that would be important, so here I go. My principal credential is having been thrown into the lagoon. I don't know if you still call it the lagoon, 50 years ago. 2 things ensued from being thrown in the lagoon. One, I married the girl that I pinned. You used to get thrown in the lagoon if you got pinned, and I had to get a penicillin shot. You guys, I don't know if you still throw people in the lagoon, but that's probably an undergraduate phenomenon. But it was quite a day for me. And it wasn't the shot that made it quite a date. It was the fact that I met my wife, who has been my lifetime supporter and is just a superhuman being. Anyway, we graduated and I began what I thought was going to be an amazing career as a concert promoter. There followed shows with Marvin Gaye, Tammy Terrell, The Temptations, The Four Tops, Sam and Dave, and the emptying of my bank account. I never made a nickel and I lost a whole lot of money. We spent a year in Washington, then moved back to New York, and I continued my quest for a job in the entertainment industry. Don Quixote had nothing on me. I couldn't even get a job as an usher at NBC. So after reading the employment section of the Times, I put on my only suit and headed to two opportunities. One was the Van Heusen Shirt Company. Today, while we maybe make 150 million dozen shirts, it's still the smallest part of our business, but I'm retired from there. And I applied for that job and for a job at Goldman Sachs before Goldman Sachs became Goldman Sachs. I took the Lexington Avenue subway, those of you who know Manhattan, from 76th Street downtown, and I was going to go to both the Van Heusen open call, so to speak, and the Goldman Sachs open call. By the time I hit Grand Central, I sweated through my suit. I'm sure I lost 6 pounds, and I said, I don't even know who Goldman Sachs is, so I got off the chain and went to Van Heusen, and I started as a clerk. I was embarrassed to tell my wife what I did, but I did it because she supported us when we were in DC, and 40 years later, I was chairman and CEO, and it was terrific, a terrific experience for me. I'll get into that in a second. As Michael said, and one of the things I feel most strongly about my career is the way we treated our workers internationally. One of my first real jobs at PVH was evaluating our productive capacity in the United States. We had 30 factories in the States, and it became very apparent to me and everybody else in the company that we couldn't sell a whole lot of $300 shirts or $500 pairs of shoes, so we couldn't produce in the United States anymore. And you haven't lived until you stood on what's called a cutting table, looked at 500 largely women, and tell them you're closing their factory. They did nothing wrong. There were no other jobs in the community. It was the worst job I ever had. The counterpoint of that was I traveled all around the world and opened new facilities. Those facilities were spectacular, better than anything we had in the United States. And that was largely a result of the culture. I was the first non-family member. PVH is a public company, but I was the first family member as CEO and chairman of the public company. And I was very proud of the factories that I participated in the opening. And we encountered what most of you probably have read in the newspaper, the experience of being lumped in with some of the most obscene sweatshop operators and importers in the world. It was absolutely horrible. I learned soon that although they were attacking me personally and attacking our company, it was not because they believed that it was true that we were a sweatshop, because clearly anybody who walked in the door knew we weren't, but because they knew they were safe when they went home at night. And most other people who imported product, labor-intensive product, electronics or apparel or footwear into the United States, they were horrible. But they knew that if they attacked the Van Heusen company or one of our other companies, they knew that they could go home at night and be relaxed and didn't have to worry about some thug showing up with a gun and compelling them to join a union. And we can talk later on if you ask a question about my view of unions, but they clearly knew that they could go home at night and vote the way they wanted the next day. The final straw relative to my difficulty at that time of my career was my son, who, as a result of his mother, who I mentioned earlier's ferocious principles, spent his junior year abroad in Zimbabwe, his gap year in Uganda, and found something called Mama Rescue to deal with the highest maternal maternal mortality rate in the world. And then he traveled to Havana for a global youth conference. You couldn't go from New York to Havana directly at that time. You had to go through Mexico. He went to Cancun and with his roommate, and I know my son, there was a lady sitting at the bar, a young woman sitting at the bar, and I'm sure he went to hit on her. Excuse me, I'm not sure if we can use that a little. And he said, "Are you going to the conference?" And she said, "No, I'm coming back from Guatemala." And he said, "What were you doing in Guatemala?" He says, "I was helping to unionize a factory that was owned by, I wish I owned a factory, owned by a guy by the name of Krapsky. And he would come into this plant every day, have a .45 strapped to his hip, shoot it into the ceiling, looked around to see if there were any women young enough to get pregnant, and kicked them in the stomach." And that's what I did. And that was it for me. I mean, I was distraught. It was one thing to attack me, but another thing to tell my son what I'm not. But it really bugged me a whole heck of a lot. We were fortunate that day because his roommate was with him and dragged him away from the bar, because I have a pretty good relationship with my son, and he knew I would not ever have done anything like that. I realized then that I needed help. Fortunately, I was introduced to Bob Bernstein. Bob is the founder of Human Rights Watch. And he called me because he had heard about this through some mutual friend, and he asked if I'd meet and have lunch with him. And he was a special guy. Unfortunately, he's recently passed away. And he asked if he could meet with me every Monday morning for a cup of coffee, and we would review how I was attacked the prior week and how I should respond, or in most of the time, not respond. After 3 years, he asked me to sit on the board of Human Rights Watch. I was the first business person to go on the board of Human Rights Watch, and it was a remarkable, remarkable experience. There followed for me 15 years of learning and contributing to the human rights of people around the planet. As the only business person, I became the treasurer, the auditor, and ultimately the vice chair of Human Rights Watch. By then, we had a $300 million annual budget and $500 million endowment. I asked him to give some of that to the law school, Michael, but and we actually had an audit firm. I used to go to the Ford Foundation, and they asked if I bring the audit partner with me, and I came back to Human Rights Watch and said, "We don't have an auditor." And so we hired Ernst & Young. They became our auditor. And at the first audit, they said, you're obligated to have a 12-year cap on your term at Human Rights Watch. I was in my 16th year, going into my 16th year. They said, we have to put a note in the financial statements and say you've been around for beyond what you're permitted to be around. So I agreed and very willingly left the board of Human Rights Watch, although I still, it's very close to my heart. So that's it about me. That's in the synopsis who I am. It's a very special privilege to be addressing you all today, because Michael convinced me to come here because Leila Sadat was going to be here, one of the real shining stars of the human rights movement. As I began to prepare, I sat at my desk and reflected on what exactly was a human right. It's sort of like crazy. My wife said, "What are you thinking about? You've been on the board for 15 years. And I was talking to her, and my thoughts drifted back to the Magna Carta, to the French Revolution, to the Emancipation Proclamation, the 30 points, I think it's 32 points of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and concluded that to speak to these many issues really would have led me not to a 3-hour or 15-minute talk, but a 3-year talk. I can't think of what's not a human right, frankly. And I believe that all of these rights are unalienable. Sometimes human rights are ambiguous. Sometimes they're evolving. 5 years ago, there was nobody would talk about technology and human rights. But are you concerned that anybody's listening on your telephone? I just heard today that at the International Court in The Hague got hacked by our friend Putin in Russia. I hope that they're not only curing the hack, but figuring out how you're going to prosecute him. That's my perception. I have to make a comment that our country, your country, has not joined the International Criminal Court. We have an informal relationship. We're one of the 3 or 4 countries that are not in the ICC. And nor have we endorsed the Landmine Treaty. So we have anybody we would fight, or who's fighting in Israel now, or Putin in the Ukraine, planting landmines. They haven't violated any principle that we've signed off on. And it would be appropriate for me to discuss human rights without making that point to all of you, and ask you all to do your best to get those treaties endorsed and supported by our country. To move off maybe the human rights subject just for a brief moment, I would make the comment that all of you, the more time you spend on human rights and your particular pleasure, the young lady in the back of the room worked at HRW. I sat in more board meetings where we argued whether we have the money and the personnel to cover all of the human rights issues on the planet. And there is no way we did. I remember standing up and saying, is it a human right to have anesthesia when you have a minor surgical procedure? It just doesn't stop. And we could never cover all the human rights in the world. So my personal view is, you who I'm fortunate enough to be addressing today, focus a bit on democracy. Just focus on democracy, which is seriously at risk in our world today. Winston Churchill said at one time, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the other forms. And that's something that really has resonated with me. Autocracy, as I said, may be more efficient, but its lack of concern for individual rights and freedoms make it fertile ground for extremism of the worst kind. Just as you leave here today, think about the horrible war crimes that exist, that I'm sure Leila will talk to us about, and think, did they occur in a democracy? They occurred in an autocracy, whether the autocracy came under a democracy or on its own. I mean, if nothing else, and I'll say his name for the last time today, Mr. Putin is an autocrat. And so many countries that live under an autocracy don't pay attention to the rights of their people, only care about their power, and that's what generates so many human rights violations. And when I make the point that there are so many human rights that you could adopt as your own cause, focus a bit about preserving democracy. Even our own country, our democracy is at risk. And spending some time thinking and advocating for the democratic rule of a country is something that is very, very, very important. And minimizing the risk that's showing up all over the world of autocracy is something that will strongly, in my judgment, help the human rights of all people. So as I begin to conclude, and let me conclude my comments with a couple of serious things. I've been very fortunate. I'm spent more time with hedge funds and equity traders than you can imagine. And was not my most enjoyable task. But I have had 4 cornerstones that have kept me and my head on straight, and made sure that no matter how much it cost us to build an air-conditioned plant, no matter how much it cost me to have a nurse in every plant, it was worthwhile. It was very worthwhile. And those 4 corners have made me the CEO that I was, and I hope my successor is, and not enough CEOs in America or the world follow this. Teddy Roosevelt once said, and here's my first cornerstone, and I quote it, "The credit belongs to the man or woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who know the great enthusiasms, the great devotion, and spends himself or herself in a worthy cause, who at best if he or she wins, knows this thrill of high achievement, as I hope most of you have. But you can't win all the time. And if you fail, at least you fail while daring and fighting greatly, so that this place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. That's my cornerstone number one. A rabbi, Hillel, once said, if we're only for ourselves, then what are we? My second cornerstone. There was a German pastor who said just prior to the Second World War, or maybe during the Second World War, first they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. My third cornerstone. I leave you all with tremendous admiration, and I forgot my fourth cornerstone. Hillel, Roosevelt. I leave all of you with great appreciation and the thought that you will all pay attention to those cornerstones. We want to be able to look back and say to all concerned, your families someday or now, your children or your grandchildren, that we did all we could and we had the resources to do all we could with the resources required to make this a better world. To make this a better world. And for me, at least at the present time, I am desperately scared of the rise in autocracy. Work for Human Rights Watch. I hope you have a great year. But the move to an autocratic form of government that is occurring all over the world, whether it's Egypt, Syria, depending on how the election goes in the United States, Thank you all very much, and thank you for your patience.
Oh, we are so lucky to have Bruce in our corner. And speaking of corners, we'll have to have you back to find out the fourth of the cornerstones.
What happened to it?
That's all right. The three that you did are some of my favorite quotes. All right, so now it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished lecturer, Leila Sadat. And as part of this lecture, we also have an award for her. So we're going to present Leila with the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center Humanitarian Award for Advancing Global Justice. So, Leila. And I want to say, Leila, as Bruce Klatsky said, is really one of the stars in the world of human rights and international criminal law. Today, you're going to hear about how she is the modern-day Raphael Lemkin. He is the person who ran around convincing people to create the Genocide Convention. And Professor Sadat has done the same thing with the Crimes Against Humanity Convention. You're going to hear all about that. But that's not all she's done over the years. She's an award-winning author. She preceded me as president and now chairman of the board of the American branch of the International Law Association, and I have the great privilege of being able to work closely with her on that. We have worked together with respect to several projects and books, and we even started a summer abroad program about international justice at Utrecht in the Netherlands that went strong for 9 years and was really a treat to do. She has been appointed by the International Criminal Court Chief Prosecutor, who you met last year, Fatou Bensouda, to be her special advisor on crimes against humanity. And everywhere you go, everybody knows the name Leila Sadat. We are so thrilled and privileged to have you tell us about the forgotten crime, forging a convention for crimes against humanity. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's so great to be here at Case Western, to be back at Case Western. And Michael and I have indeed been co-conspirators on many projects in the past, and I hope we'll continue to do that in the future. I have to also give a shout out to Bruce Klatsky and his generosity. We're very lucky in the United States that we, especially those of us that teach at great institutions like Case Western, or I'm at Washington University in St. Louis, and I have a fellowship at Yale. And we have resources that they just don't have elsewhere in the world. And thanks to benefactors and generous donors, we're able to do work that just couldn't be done anywhere else in the world. And so I was very lucky, 15 years ago, when Whitney Harris, who was the last living member of Justice Jackson's team at Nuremberg, endowed the Harris Institute. And I thought, what do I want to do as the director? I was the third director at that time. And I said, you know what? We really need a treaty on crimes against humanity. And without the generosity of people like Mr. Klatsky, without the generosity of Whitney Harris, we just couldn't do this work. And I think it is right now, at a time of turmoil and unrest, when donors are sort of thinking about, do I really want to give to that? It's really important that you continue to do so. It's really important because there's not much money in human rights, right? Because you're working for the vulnerable, for the downtrodden, for the people that have been forgotten, in a sense. And so without resources, it's very difficult to lift those individuals up and to do the kind of hard thinking, analyzing, creating, and working to be able to change that. And so I'm deeply grateful to Case Western, to Dean Scharf, to Mr. Klatsky, and to all of you, who we're going to spend, I guess, a really quick half hour together talking about crimes against humanity. This is a hard subject, right? So it's an emotional subject, and hopefully I can get my PowerPoint to work. Where are my tech people? It's
You just say next slide. Sometimes
next. Could you get the? It's kind of. I think it might have timed out. If you can. There we go. Okay. Can you read it? It's a little small, but and if I can. There we go. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So it's big behind me. Great. So why are crimes against humanity forgotten crimes? Why do I call this the forgotten crime? In a way, it's forgotten victims and devastated survivors who have been forgotten about. Forgotten crime scenes. They take place all over the world in places that we can't go to, whether it's North Korea or Syria or parts of China or elsewhere. And forgotten justice, right? Because we don't have a treaty. And so what can we do for those left behind? And I do have a short video. I think what I'll do, just in the interest of time, is just play a couple of the victim testimonials that are in this and not the second half. Is that okay? Or my wonderful tech people, are you able to do that? It is a little bit, there's nothing, you're not going to see anything horrible. Probably better than what we're seeing on CNN right now, to be honest. But, I'm so used to this that sometimes I sort of forget that for somebody who's not used to it, the stories are heartrending. So if you need to take a deep breath, you need to walk out of the room. It's only 2 minutes, and it's sort of 3 or 4 stories from around the world. Do you want to just, because that's who we're talking about, right? We're talking about victims.
Kumkuta unampani na kila kitu unafanya kafanya.
Mungu unasema kama watapatia malipizi wale wenyewe walifanya vile. Sio unaka wanasema wapinire mtu mwenye agresere mwenye alifanya kitendo cha ubakaji.
At the end of World War II, in a courtroom in Nuremberg, Nazi officers were convicted of crimes against humanity.
The horror I cannot describe to you.
70 years after those trials, there is still no global treaty for the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity.
What that means is that the words uttered after Nuremberg never again have but a hollow significance.
Crimes against humanity, as the term suggests, are some of the worst international crimes. They are widespread and systematic attacks perpetrated against the civilian population, and they occur far too often, in particular, in the context of domestic political turmoil and conflict.
والله جمعت بوستي اونلاين طلعت الصوره مال بنتي عملت بوستها وجدها رب العالمين لا تحرمون من عيالكم وانا ما عندي احد برا.
The victims are always the most vulnerable civilians, women and children. And the perpetrators are almost always those who have as main mandate to just protect those vulnerable populations, and they're doing the opposite.
공개체험하는 장소에서 만약에 가족이라든지 그 친구가 울거나 이랬다면 그 자리에서 바로 체포돼서 구형을 들어가서 바로 또 총살시켜야 되는.
What is really missing in the arsenal of legal instruments is a specific treaty, specific convention in relation to crimes against humanity.
Je disais toujours aux gens que nous, en tant que survivants de torture, il nous manque quelque chose. De tout ce qu'on a vécu, vraiment, il n'y a que cette justice qui devait nous donner.
What we still don't.
Eric, I think we can cut it here because basically I'm going to fill in this. You can see, right? Anybody recognize any of those situations? A lot of students here, right? North Korea. We saw essentially detention and torture, arbitrary arrest and detention. Democratic Republic of the Congo, rape, sexual violence, right? You saw Iraq, ISIS. It's a non-state actor, right? Terrorist organization. You saw a Holocaust survivor. Chad, Hissène Habré, that was a famous victim who was partially responsible for helping to get Hissène Habré convicted on charges essentially of torture. And so crimes against humanity, sort of to the point about human rights, if you look at my chart, this is what I call an atrocity cascade. These are crimes that happen because the normal things that stop crimes from happening are not happening in a particular state or region. And they can happen in peacetime as well as in wartime. And so one of the differences between crimes against humanity and war crimes, right? We don't need an armed conflict in order to have a crime against humanity. And it's also different than the crime of genocide, which we can also talk about. But human rights violations, which happen in every country, right? There's not a single country in the world that doesn't have some human rights issues. When I teach my course in human rights, I'm like, come on. And people say, how about New Zealand? And we can always find one, even in New Zealand, right? Or in Denmark or some other country you think doesn't have human rights problems because they're everywhere. But they can grow if they're not addressed, and grow and grow and metastasize. And if they metastasize too far, they become crimes against humanity. And that's basically this frontier between human rights violation and criminality is where we're actually trying to draft this instrument to address that. Because if you think about prevention, which is the key, and one of the things that the new treaty will do, you want to stop crimes against humanity before it becomes genocide or before armed conflict breaks out and the entire situation spins out of control. And Syria is a great example of that. It was a situation where there were lots of human rights violations. They got progressively worse. The government fired on protesters. The protesters then take up arms, and all of a sudden you're in a civil war and 500,000 civilians are dead. And so that's really important to think about crime. Sorry, now I did something. Crimes against humanity. So they originate at Nuremberg, but honestly, they really originate in slavery and the slave trade. And I put this slide in. I was thinking about this. We do use Nuremberg as our starting point because it's the first time, or sometimes you'll hear it called Tokyo-berg, because there was also a Tokyo trial as well as a Nuremberg trial. But it was really slavery and the slave trade in the 19th century. That is the first example that you start hearing the term crimes against humanity used. But at Nuremberg is when it actually gets codified. And it gets codified as an international crime by Robert Jackson, and I put a little quote from him about how extraordinary it was that they even held a trial. And I'm sure if you've taken a course with Professor Johnson or Dean Scharf, you've learned all about the Nuremberg trials and how important they were, these iconic moments We can talk about some of the criticisms as well, but it's the first time we see this crime actually codified, and we have language. So what is it? Widespread or systematic attacks against civilians that include crimes such as murder, deportation, enslavement, other inhumane acts, or persecution, campaigns of persecution. And that's what you could see from the victimization. Do you see there's some radical language down at the bottom? Whether or not in violation of the domestic law of the country were perpetrated. This crime is a gap filler. It's because what the Nazis were doing was killing citizens in their own country, not just using war to attack civilian populations. And there was no way, because states are sovereign and they have the right to do what they want inside their territory, there was no way actually to convict them of crimes for having done that unless we invented a new crime. And so this crime against humanity was there to sort of fill the gap between the laws of war and the crime against peace, to allow an indictment for what individuals were doing, not only to the citizens in occupied territories, but to the citizens in Germany. And there were important prosecutions during the Nuremberg trial that related to the Holocaust for exactly that reason. And before that, we couldn't do that. And so when I teach my human rights course, I say the flip side of having duties under international law, right, is you can acquire a right under international law. And so the Nuremberg trials give rise not only to the notion of individual criminal responsibility, but to all of the human rights that Human Rights Watch and other organizations now enforce and protect. As I said, crimes against humanity are different from the other crimes. They have different material elements. They protect different social values. You can have them in peacetime, which is different than how it was in Nuremberg. They fill a gap in the law of wars. They also apply to non-state actors. So you saw in the little examples I gave you, the North Korean state is a state actor that actually has detention camps in which prisoners are maltreated, and they think there are about 100,000 people in those detention camps. Forgotten, locked away, can't see them, right? But terrible victimization. But you also have places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo where it's the militias. You have 19 different militias operating on the territory. And so the victims of sexual violence in those cases are often the victims of non-state actors. The same with ISIS is a non-state actor. So we didn't have a definition of crimes against humanity. We never had a treaty. We had a genocide convention, but we never got a crimes against humanity convention, probably because states were a little nervous about this, right? We don't really know why. It's hard to prove a negative, but think of how broad it is. It applies to state and non-state actors. It's this whole huge basket of crimes. It can happen in peacetime as well as wartime, and I think states were very nervous about it. And the first time we get a modern codification is when the ICC statute is negotiated in 1998. And Sharif Bassiouni, who Michael and I both had the pleasure to know and work with well a long time ago, Sharif chaired the drafting committee for the Rome Statute, and at Rome we finally make progress getting a definition. And as you can see, this modern definition is much longer, right, than the Nuremberg definition. Includes more crimes, includes enforced disappearances, which was something we saw from the Latin American experience, very much a signature crime, the desaparecidos, they were called. Includes apartheid, because there had been an apartheid convention. Includes other kinds of inhumane acts, and you notice the sort of rape, sexual slavery, and forced prostitution, the sort of gender and sexual based crimes are much more extensive because this is a much more modern instrument. And so it's longer, but states are a little nervous about it, so they also restrict it and say that to have a crime against humanity, it has to be undertaken pursuant to a state or organizational policy. So you have to show not only that the individual committed the crime, right? If you've taken crim law for my law students, right? The actus reus is the killing or the deportation or the enslavement or the murder. The mens rea is that they did so knowingly or with awareness. But it has to happen within the context of a widespread and systematic attack on a civilian population and be carried out pursuant to a state or organizational policy, which is a very high threshold. It's why whenever there's a conflict, and you'll hear individuals say this is a crime against humanity, or this is a genocide, or these are war crimes, we have to be really careful as lawyers. Politicians do what politicians do. People can say whatever they want. As lawyers, we know that the thresholds are actually very high. The standards of proof are beyond a reasonable doubt. There are civil uses of this terminology, like the International Court of Justice can hear cases involving genocide. That's different than a criminal case. But for criminal cases, these are hard cases to prove, but they're important cases. So the International Criminal Court has been operating now, it just celebrated its 25th anniversary, and we've learned some really interesting things about crimes against humanity from the ICC. I did a big study that I published in 2013 where I counted every single charge in every single case at the ICC, and one of the extraordinary things that we saw at the ICC is, unlike any of the other tribunals, 30% of all the cases filed in that court are only crimes against humanity cases. That's kind of a knock you down statistic, because prior to that, the crimes against humanity cases would always track the war crimes cases because armed conflict was required for a crime against humanity. It's only by separating the two and allowing the ICC to operate in real time that we've been able to do that. So if you look at the list of current situations, Bangladesh, Myanmar, crimes against humanity only. Burundi, Cote d'Ivoire, Philippines, Kenya, Venezuela 1 and 2. All of those are cases in which the prosecutor is only looking at crimes against humanity, not at war crimes and not at genocide. And that's a very interesting, we can talk about that a little bit in the Q&A, but that's, again, a key reason why this new treaty is so important. So we got the Rome Statute. Why do we need a new treaty? Trust me, I've had that question for the last 15 years. Well, you kind of know if you've studied anything about the ICC, it doesn't take a whole lot of cases, right? We've only had about 31 cases in 25 years, which is not super impressive. Hopefully it's going to be going faster and do more cases, but it also is a court of last resort. And that means it's not supposed to take all the cases in the world. The other thing you don't get in the ICC is a duty to prevent. And prevention, right, is worth, what is it, an ounce of cure? You really want to get at these crimes before they happen, which means you have to build state capacity and you have to have an enforceable duty like we have in the Genocide Convention. You need interstate enforcement, so states need to be able to cooperate with each other and offer mutual legal assistance. The ICC essentially offers a vertical mechanism. The Crimes Against Humanity Treaty is an interstate. It's a horizontal mechanism where national courts will do the jobs themselves. And you might be surprised, like in the US, we can't prosecute crimes against humanity because we don't have a federal statute, which is a huge gap in US law. We have a war crimes statute, we have a genocide statute, we do not have a crimes against humanity statute. And that's a problem for us, right? If somebody shows up, not that the Myanmar generals are going to be wandering around Cleveland, but if they were, we could not arrest on crimes against humanity grounds the way we could for torture or genocide or war crimes. And that's really important because we also can't demand their extradition on those grounds or cooperate with other states and give them legal assistance. So there's lots of technical reasons. And so I started the initiative in 2007, really, that was the brainchild, and we had our first meeting. Dean Scharf was there, but he left before the photo. So someday we're gonna have to put you in, like we're gonna have to Photoshop you in, Michael. We had a wonderful steering committee. There's no quiz, you guys can come closer, but we had a wonderful steering committee from sort of all over the world that helped direct the project, including Richard Goldstone and Hans Corell, some of the famous people that you've had at your law school. And we wrote a treaty. We wrote the world's first Crimes Against Humanity treaty, and this is the crux, that crimes against humanity, whether committed during war or peace, are crimes for which there's individual liability and state liability. Now, as you'll see later, the state liability part is now implicit, not explicit, because states didn't want it said explicitly, but we think it's still there. And the idea was to build it on a Martin's Clause, take the Rome Statute definition, the ICC definition as the centerpiece, provide the horizontal mechanism, and build upon 4 pillars. That is this normative idea that you have a right to be free from the commission of crimes against humanity. And it was actually a survivor of sexual violence in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that said that to me. She said, you know, I never realized, like, I had to write for that not to happen to me. It was kind of one of those moments where, you know, I gave my little, like, law talk. And the way it landed with her is, you mean they don't have a right to do that? And we're like, no, it's illegal. You're not allowed to do that. But you need laws and courts and institutions in order to make that happen. And so we want prevention and capacity building. And we translated our project into a bunch of languages. You can find it on my website. And there's a fact sheet circulating as well that has some information. And then it got into the United Nations. And here I just have to say this must have been divine intervention, because we held a conference at the Brookings Institution in 2010. I invited all the DC law profs who sort of work in this field to come. And Sean Murphy just showed up at our conference, you know, and then he got nominated by the United States to run for the International Law Commission and made doing this treaty his sort of signature ILC activity. And he won his election campaigning on this. So we know that states are, you know, at least some states are enthusiastic. The International Law Commission meets in Geneva every summer. I started sitting in Geneva every summer from 2013 on to watch the ILC work, which was kind of interesting. I learned a lot about how they work. And they worked for a long time. And I'm not going to go through all these slides, but basically the way it happens is Professor Murphy would write a report, the commission would debate the report, they'd go into a drafting committee, they'd produce 1 or 2 articles of the draft treaty, just 1 or 2 in a year, and then the next year they would do the same thing. He'd write another report, the commission would meet, they'd debate it, they'd go into drafting committee, they'd do another 2 articles. So it's kind of an iterative process. And what's really interesting, so because I'm a scholar, I started tracking our government's liking this, right? And so if you go on my website, you'll see like page after page of data. But what I think is really fascinating is at the beginning, can you sort of see, like there are a handful of positive states, 10 states, right? Not very many states. We have 193 states in the international community. They're not paying much attention to this. It's not on their radar screen. People are like, yeah, whatever, the ILC, they're doing this thing. And by the end, we're like, okay, we're up to 55 states have paid attention to this. That's pretty good. As you'll see, we're now up to 122 positive states, okay? So it's been growing enormously over time. We then had the ILC produced a whole draft in 2017. States made comments in 2018, and they were largely positive. There are a few that are negative. You can guess which ones. We can talk about that in the Q&A because I want to kind of get through this. And then they do a second draft. So now what the commission does is Professor Murphy does a 4th report. They take all the, the government comments and they do a new draft. And the 2019 draft is, these are the current articles. Okay, so they come out of the commission, and then the commission submits its report to the General Assembly. And so now instead of going to Geneva every summer, I go to New York every fall, and I see what are states doing? Are they talking about it? Are they excited? And in 2019, we were so excited. And I'm not going to go through the articles because they basically copied what we did, but it's not as good. Okay, I didn't say that, but that's basically what they did. And even though it took them 6 years, and they had to do it independently, and there's some things that are interesting there. So these are some open questions, and my slide is probably too small, but there's some really interesting things happening now, right? People are like, what about the slave trade? Should we add that? What about gender apartheid? What about forced marriage as a new crime? What about ecocide? Should we add that? Amnesty International doesn't want military courts. It wants a prohibition on amnesties. What about a treaty monitoring mechanism? We had one, the ILC took it out, so that's still on the table. So now it's sitting with states, but unfortunately, the way the 6th committee works, and here was the recommendation of the International Law Commission, is that these draft articles should become a treaty. Either the General Assembly should do this or an international conference of plenipotentiaries. Well, and when I showed this slide to my husband, he said, it was really their 3,499th meeting? It really was. This is how long it's taken to get this done. So what happens? We go to the 6th committee, and the 6th committee works by consensus. I didn't know this. So it's not like other things where you can have some are for, some are against, and you just have a vote and you decide what to do. If any state opposes it, it doesn't go from the 6th committee to negotiations. Well, Russia and China don't like this treaty. I wonder why. And there are a few other states too, but those are the ones that have the heft, right? They're permanent members of the Security Council. They have a lot of power in the General Assembly. And in 2019, we weren't getting a lot of support from the US either. So they all have this conversation. Austria says, we'll host the diplomatic conference. We're all ready to go to Vienna. We hear a big nyet out of the Russians, and we're done. 2020, same thing, but this is even worse because 2020 is the pandemic year. Civil society can't get in the building, and everything is virtual. So there's virtually no discussion of the treaty, and I'm going to skip some of that. So you can see in 2019, okay, now we got more states here. We have 57 positive. We have 8 that aren't really taking an explicit view. We have about 14 negative. But now we have 80 states. We kind of ignore 2020 because it's the pandemic year. So 6th committee, we go back. 2021, year 3. Still no civil society. We're still not allowed in the building. But they are meeting in person. And this time, you get a lot more activity from states. They really thought they were going to have a breakthrough. We get a lot more positivity this time. We're up to 76 if you count the neutrals. And Russia just says, no, we need more time to study. This is now 4 years, right? Plus the 6 the ILC worked on and the 75 since Nuremberg. So year 4, we get a breakthrough. And that's been really thrilling. And what happened is my good friends from Mexico and the Gambia put together a cross-regional group. And for you procedure students, you'll love this. They did what Pablo Arrocha, the Mexican legal advisor, says is we flipped the tortilla. And essentially what they did is they deposited the resolution a week before the meeting was held. And so they put on the table a resolution creating an ad hoc committee that would meet for a year and vote and go to a diplomatic conference. And they tabled that resolution, making the naysayers having to react to their resolution rather than spend weeks sort of trying to create a resolution that everybody could agree on. And so that shift in procedure for all you law students and lawyers, like it's brilliant how the procedural shift really changed the dynamics of the meeting. We'll see when we look at this a lot more negatives this year because it was a fight, right? It was a real fight. Russia's writing letters to the Bureau saying this is an illegal process, you're not allowed to do this is an outrage, how dare they? And the Secretariat said they can do this, any state can table a resolution. You also see a lot more positivity now. Now you have 100 states who are positive. And for the states who are quiet, a lot of times they're small countries that just don't have the bandwidth. The other thing that's happening here is Russia has invaded Ukraine. And that is causing Russia to lose legitimacy at the General Assembly and in the United Nations. Even if the GA is not voting on every anti-Russia resolution out there, Russia just doesn't have the pull it has. And China doesn't tend to play the same spoiler in the General Assembly. If states want something, even if they're not going to support it, they'll sort of say, okay, whatever. And so China actually worked with the United States, the UK, and the members of the core group to get a 2-year process. And that's what we ended up with. And so we got a 2-year process during which states are now negotiating substance. We're finally out of the procedural vortex that we couldn't get out of, and states are talking about the actual treaty. The Africa group, as I said, is very interesting in adding the words the slave trade to the provision on enslavement because they feel that that is very different than enslavement itself. Women's organizations in particular are interested in expanding the gender competency of the new treaty in a lot of ways. And so there are some risks, right? Because there's a risk of regression based on all the authoritarian governments out there, and there's a risk of, and there's a possibility of opportunity. So right now, we were just there 2 weeks ago, went very, very well, and what was interesting to me, and this is kind of a back of the envelope, so this is not the official tally, because what my students will do, I have a team at Yale and I have a team at WashU, and we literally pour through all the statements, because sometimes states say things like, I'd like to congratulate the chair on their election, and you know, they say all kinds of nice things, but they're not actually supporting the treaty, right? It's just kind of Diplo speak. And honestly, the current conflict, there were a lot of very hostile statements made by states, one against each other, not just Israel, Palestine, but Armenia, Azerbaijan was a very hot one, and India, Pakistan. So we had a lot of inflammatory sort of statements during the meetings. But you can see we're now up to 110 states positive, 7 neutral, and the negatives are going down. And so what's been fascinating to me, even just as an international lawyer, I used to do business deals before I did this, you get a bunch of lawyers in the room talking about substance, they just sort of calm down. They're like, I don't think that's a good solution. I'd like to propose this solution, as opposed to the process, which really, really drove the negatives. When we talk about the substance, I think especially the legal advisors, they like talking about law, right? They, including the Russian Federation, had a much calmer statement this year, for example, than it did last year. We also passed out our wrist bracelets, which were a big hit. You can get one. It says #CrimesAgainstHumanity Treaty now. But I think there's starting to be a sense of this is a collective enterprise. We know a lot of states are not going to ratify this treaty. We don't expect Russia and China to ratify this treaty tomorrow. Although Russia is a party to the Genocide Convention, right? So you never know. States ratify treaties for all kinds of reasons. But we are sort of cautiously optimistic that next year, which is going to be the big year in 2024, the treaty is actually going to get out. We're going to be in Vienna in 2025, and we're going to be negotiating the text of the new convention. So I think I'll stop there. I tried to keep within the time limit, and if there's time for questions, I'd love to take questions.
Let's
Thank
do
you.
10 minutes of Q&A, and then we're going to have this reception up in Ben's place, and people can talk to you one-on-one as well.
And you deserve a reception. Nobody wants to, there's no test on this. Ask questions, yeah.
So I had a question. Oh, thank you. I had a question with the new treaty in relation to maybe finalizing jurisdiction or a role, if any, of continuing crimes, like you highlighted enforced disappearances. You mentioned this sort of interstate enforcement, possible prohibition on amnesties, the idea of prevention of these crimes. When you're looking at a crime like enforced disappearances without a clear end, how do you see a role there?
So that's such a great question, and it depends on what states do with the Rome Statute, because the Rome Statute has a limit on enforced disappearances that is not in the Enforced Disappearances Convention of 2006. So that is, I think, an open question. What's really interesting is there's some states that say you can't touch the Rome Statute, it's sort of sacred, and there are other states that say, well, but it's 25 years old, maybe it's time to rethink some of that. And remember, some of the limits that are appropriate in the Rome Statute are because it's an international court, right? That has to have these very high jurisdictional thresholds. It's only going to take the worst of the worst cases, whereas national courts should be much freer to use their national law. And so I think that's going to be a very interesting conversation. The Latin America group has been behind this treaty 200% really since the get-go. I would say they've been the most enthusiastic regional group outside of Europe. And I think it'll be very much them that will drive that conversation. It's a great question. It's not the only continuing crime. There are other continuing crimes. So, you know what? All these treaties only have prospective application. They're never going to put a retroactive application in that because no state will sign it. That said, sometimes states will retroactively go into their national law and actually change things. We saw that in Chile, we saw it in Argentina, we saw it in France. the World War II cases. So states can do that on their own. Nowadays, we tend to have a stronger feeling that they shouldn't do it, especially if they're new crimes. So I think that's where, for example, ecocide, if we put ecocide in, that's clearly a new crime, right? So I think their retroactive application could be more problematic than with some of the crimes that have been around since 1945. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Other questions? Yeah.
Don't you see the problem is not with the statute itself or the law or the treaty, other than the enforcement mechanism? For me, it's fine to work with the present statute or the treaties, but don't you think that there's something that we, as a lawyer, as a legal justice supporters, do something with the enforcement mechanism?
Yeah. So, Tom Bergenthal, may he rest in peace, was one of the great human rights lawyers, right? And then became a member of the International Court of Justice. And he would always say, you need rules, you need institutions, and you need enforcement. So national courts are good institutional enforcers. Does that make sense? At least in Western democracies, and even in Latin America, in many parts of Asia, in many parts of Africa. So the reason you want a treaty like this that's promoting state enforcement of the norms is that they're just going to be better enforcers. They're going to be better institutions to do that. The difficulty, of course, if the crimes happen in North Korea, the North Korean courts are not about to take these cases, right? So there are going to be pockets of the world where it just stays black for a while. We just can't get to those situations. And there we can't wave a magic wand either at the international or the national level. We try containment. We prosecute individuals if they leave those countries, right? So we can try to do that. We use other tools like sanctions, which have some other problematic effects, but we try to sort of sanction those governments in ways, but we have very indirect tools. And that's, we still live in a world of sovereign states. That's the best I can say. One of the things is, and the United Nations is an important space to have those conversations because states do move their positions. Sometimes I know it feels from the outside like they never do. They do, actually. Yeah. It's just slow. Other questions? You guys are waiting for the reception? Yeah.
I'm outside of the law school student community, international law school student community. How exactly do international work, didn't even realize, how exactly do crimes that are committed by nations, but not necessarily nation states, get prosecuted in terms of, it's still considered a war crime, but it's not necessarily committed by someone who has territory to attach their sovereignty to?
You mean the non-state actors like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or groups like that, or Hamas these days, right? So you have the non-state actors sometimes have territory and sometimes they don't have territory. Typically they have a base of operations, Boko Haram, right? I worked a lot at the Mali prosecution, Ansar al-Dine, and when they blew up the shrines at Timbuktu. They have bases of operations and territory. They have sort of rudimentary forms of government, right? They come in and they impose laws, but they don't have to. They can be just an organized armed group under a hierarchical command that's committing a crime. They can commit crimes against humanity, which means, and what are those crimes? They're attacking the civilian population in some way. They're usually, that's why I say those are typically also war crimes, because often some other entity is fighting those armed groups, right? So Nigerian government's trying to get Boko Haram to stop. They're armed groups fighting other armed groups in the DRC. So that creates a non-international armed conflict. So there are war crimes happening parallel to the crimes against humanity, or the crimes against humanity can happen independently. I mean, one of the big ones now is the way the Taliban are treating women in Afghanistan. I mean, the gender persecution is just shocking. And it has nothing to do with armed conflict, right? They're just creating rules for the oppression of women and girls. And so that's a classic case of crimes against humanity perpetrated, I guess you'd call them the state. We don't recognize that government, but they're in de facto control of the country for sure. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. One last question? Yeah.
To what degree does this treaty track and deviate from the Genocide Convention in terms of procedural mechanisms?
Oh, what a great question. So it builds a lot on the Genocide Convention in the duty to prevent and the duty to punish. The thing is, the Genocide Convention is from 1948, so it's our oldest other than the Geneva Conventions, and it doesn't have a lot of the I won't say bells and whistles, but a lot of the features that the more modern treaties have. So, for example, they set out jurisdiction in the Genocide Convention as territorial. That's not very helpful. All the modern international conventions talk about universal jurisdiction, nationality jurisdiction, passive personality, all the different bases of jurisdiction. And so what we did, and what the ILC basically, I won't say copied, but is you take the Torture Convention, the Apartheid Convention, the Genocide Convention, the Enforced Disappearances Convention, you have a look at all the instruments, and you kind of create the substantive law for crimes against humanity drawing from those treaties. And then the other thing that's really interesting is the interstate cooperation principles. They don't come from Genocide Convention at all because they don't talk about it. They come from the Corruption Treaty and all the other treaties on transnational organized crime. And the reason is, and this is sort of an in-the-weeds thing, but we have much stronger enforcement for the transnational crimes than for these core crimes. The terrorism treaties, the organized corruption treaty, the money laundering, all of those treaties have pages and pages of pages. You can get asset forfeiture. You can get all kinds of evidence. You can create joint investigative teams. You designate central authorities for the exchange of evidence. And so what the ILC did, what the new Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, which I didn't talk about because it's not enforced yet, what our treaty does, is it takes those modern transnational crime procedures and puts them on sort of one of the older crimes. Does that make sense? And so it would be a much more effective treaty than the Genocide Convention or the Geneva Conventions. The Genocide Convention just says, oh, you have to prevent and punish, but not how. Well, how are you going to do that? Like, I need evidence from over here, and I need to do this, and I need video testimony, and so we actually took, and the ILC did the same thing in one of their annexes, we actually took the provisions of the modern transnational treaties and married them to this core crime. And so that's going to make it much more effective. You can use it like we can, like the US has indicted half of the Venezuelan government, right? And how did we do that? We used federal law and all the treaties that cover corruption, organized crime, and then we have extradition that's available on those bases. We can't do that now for crimes against humanity. We can't do it for genocide. We can't do it for war crimes. So that's a huge gap in the law, that mutual legal assistance piece. And so the idea is if states really care about preventing this, they have to be ready to punish it, and to punish it in a transnational way that you kind of tighten the net so that individuals can't just slip through. So yeah, really important piece of it. All right, I think I talked too much. Sorry.
But I think that your lifting the veil on this process has been really enlightening, exciting, interesting. And it is just so awesome to have the architect of new international law with us to share this experience with us. And it's inspiring. So please, once again, a big hand.